So part two of our station monitoring series. And I call it a series because this turned out to be a little more complicated subject than I was planning on. Now let's go way back in the history of ham radio, back into the teens. In the teens, probably through the 1920s, ham radio was regulated only in a loose way. Remember, hams have been relegated to the frequencies 200 meters and down. That is the high frequencies, the short waves. And between that time of, say, 1915 and 1925, it was determined that that might have been a mistake, that these frequencies really were useful. The whole world woke up to the fact that shortwave was going to be a big deal, both in commerce and in military. The hams were going to be allocated to smaller, more regimented bands. Fortunately, the bands would be harmonic related. That is, if you happen to emit harmonics or spurs 80 meters and something shows up on 40 meters or 20 meters or 10 meters, these would all be harmonically related, and theoretically the hams would only be interfering with themselves. So that was a great idea. But there was a deadline coming up, and that deadline was the end of 1929. In 1930, through both an international treaty and allocations approved by the Congress and the Commerce Department, which was running radio at that time, the hams would have new, tighter bands that they had to stay in. Now, staying inside the band allocation before this time was kind of interesting. It was suggested. Hams were all over the place. Sometimes they were even in the band. But now they were going to have to be within the bands. The typical ham station at this time was a free-running oscillator of some kind. It could be a one-tube or perhaps a two-tube transmitter, along with a one or a two-tube regenerative receiver. And that comprised the ham station with your antenna, and you were on the air. There was some phone activity, but it was restricted. Typically, it was operating in the 1750 kilohertz band, just above what we call the broadcast band now. That was a ham band at that time. That's where most of the phone work was occurring. But for the most part, it was all CW at this time. So how do you determine frequency? How do you know if you're inside the band? We're talking about the quality of the signal being important. But before you even get into the quality of the signal or the width of the signal or spurs and harmonics and every other type of problem we have, let's just be in the band, okay? Let's make sure we're on frequency. The way of determining frequency. At that time, with your regenerative receiver, you could basically had this 0 to 100 scale, and you could say, make a chart which would allocate the 0 to 100 scale to a frequency in kilohertz. Most of the receivers were either dedicated to one band or they used plug-in coils. So you could make a series of lines called a nomograph on a chart, and you could calibrate your receiver. That was the normal way of doing it. But how do you get that powerful transmitter to be able to be detected by the receiver so that you know you're on frequency? It still was a problem. You still had a hard time getting your transmitter and your receiver on the same frequency. So there was a device developed, actually before World War I. It was called the frequency meter. I have a frequency meter right here. This is a general radio frequency meter, and this was released in 1929 expressly for ham radio operators. So this is the real artifact. This device came with a series of coils that would attach to these binding posts, and with this frequency meter you could determine your frequency probably within 1% if you were trying really hard. Anyway, I'm going to demonstrate how to use a frequency meter. This was the first instrument in the ham shack, by the way, hams couldn't generally afford instruments in their shack, so most of these were home brew as well. And we're going to find out how we calibrate something like this. Now, these devices have been called wave meters since the beginning of time, practically. Magazines like QST continue to call this a frequency meter, even though we call it a wave meter. It's always been called a wave meter, by the way, but QST called it a frequency meter because we preferred to talk about frequency from this time on rather than wavelength. The second method that was popular at that time was by using a shielded oscillator. If you take a regular Hartley oscillator or a Armstrong style oscillator or a Colpitts oscillator and put it in a shielded box, now you have a device that puts out a very weak signal that you can pick up with your regen and you can zero beat it. You could calibrate the dial of that shielded oscillator and that would be a frequency standard for your station. If you added earphones to that, you had basically a self-oscillating regen in a shielded box. Now you could go the other way, and you could transmit and zero beat your signal with the shielded regen. So the shielded regen, or the shielded oscillator, was another way of determining frequency in the mid-20s, probably through the mid-30s. So those are your two tools, the shielded oscillator or shielded regen, or the wave meter. Those were the only two ways of determining frequency. But what about crystals? Crystals existed. The 1926 handbook features crystals in the experimenter area of the manual. Well, the reason it's in the experimenter part of the manual is crystals ran between $15 and $25 each in 1928, 1929. Now, $15 in 1929 was a lot of money, and hams really couldn't afford to have crystals. So that's out. We're not going to be using crystals to determine our frequency. We simply can't afford them. So stand by. We're going to talk about the various methods for calibrating and staying inside the band. So this is a regen. This regen has coupling control. Now I'm going to demonstrate something called clicking, and basically the clicking allows you to find out what frequency the regen is on. So if we bring the wave meter in so that the coil's somewhat lined up, okay, you can see that we're somewhere in 80 meters, right around 3,500. Now that makes sense because this is DX. It's right at the very, very low end of the band. And the way we know that is with the wave meter. You can see with the wave meter that we can determine that the regen is tuned just above 3,500. By using a wave meter in conjunction with your regen, as long as the wave meter is calibrated, you can use a very low capacity, like a gimmick or a couple picofarad capacitor, coupled over the wave meter, and the wave meter can actually be inserted right inside the receiver. So you'd have basically two verniers. One vernier for the wave meter, which is in its own shielded compartment, connected only to the receiver through that low value capacitance, and then the regular regen, both in the same package. That way you can determine what frequency you're on using the local wave meter. So let's talk about the instruments, primarily the frequency monitor and the wave meter.
We have a typical 1929 station, and the station has a fine receiver, the station monitor in the middle, and the transmitter to the right. This is representative of a well-apportioned ham station of the early 30s. During the late 20s, starting around 1927, frequency stability and frequency setting became very, very important because of the rulemaking for the 1930 standards. So QST and Radio Magazine were both full of articles on how to build these frequency setting devices. Certainly the frequency meter combined with the receiver was one idea, but a lot of people wanted to make dedicated monitors, some of them just oscillators, some of them shielded regens, and some of them shielded regens with the addition of a wave meter. These types of devices were very useful in the shack, and this was a way to stay in the band and on frequency. Being able to net your transmitter to your receiver and to be able to net a station that you were listening to became very important. And these frequency meters, especially frequency meters that were combined with your receiver, became very important. So fear is a fantastic motivator for you to open your wallet. And of course, with the impending doom of 1930, where you had to remain in the band, a lot of people started to think about purchasing precision instruments from various companies. And companies like General Radio would benefit greatly from those regulations. Now, a wave meter is really nothing but a coil and a variable condenser. Yes, they were called condensers then, and variable condensers could be made with very high precision. So with a set of calibrated coils and a variable condenser, you could build your own wave meter. So many hams opted to build their own.
So there's nothing too special about this coil. It's 40 turns of double cotton covered solid number 24. And you can wire that with regular enameled wire if you want, shooting for 25 microhenries on this 1-inch form. The build of the wave meter itself, it looks kind of funny. It's using overly stout wire, but I wanted to try to get everything somewhat stable. You'll notice I have a small capacitor here that I use to pad the 250 puff cap. That could be a trimmer. A couple of trimmers in here would not be a bad idea. The double pull, double throw switch right here, that could be a rotary switch. That would probably be better. Notice I'm using insulated shaft out to the knob, going into a coupler and then into the capacitor. This is like a 140 picofarad cap. It's backwards. Frequency goes down as you turn clockwise. I don't like this capacitor. Rather have it go the other way. If you could get a capacitor that was straight line corrected, you'd have a little bit better scale. This isn't too bad, but you'll notice it's a little bit scrunched on the low end and it opens up too wide on the high end. I haven't got the whole band in here either. I was able to get all of 80 meters, but on 160, I'm only covering really the CW band and a little more. If you had a 250 puff or even a 365 puff cap, it probably would be better than what I used here. And if you've got a vernier you could put in here, that would not be a bad idea. Anyway, there's not a lot to this. It's a very, very simple circuit. And you don't have to do it in two bands like I did, 160/80. You could do it purely with plug-in coils like the pros did. And this schematic is nothing special. It's just basically a coil and a capacitor. It's just we've got the capacitors such that we can adjust the band spread as well as the band itself. So that takes a couple of capacitors on each band to be able to get things spread out on the dial the way you'd like to see them for 80 and 40 or 80 and 160 or 40 and 20 or whatever you want to design the thing. So it's actually a case where the simpler instrument with just the variable capacitor or condenser and the coil is a superior instrument compared to a fancier wave meter that might include detector, headphone attachment, and all kinds of other things that you could add. Wave meters can get quite complex. But in the way that we're using it, where we just want to adjust a regenerative receiver or check our transmitter frequency, it turns out that the simpler coil and capacitor type wave meter makes the most sense. You don't need a detector, you don't need a meter, you're simply letting the device influence the tuned circuit on the transmitter or receiver and letting the indicator on the transmitter and receiver do the work. Now, in my wave meter that I constructed, it is just a simple wave meter with just, variable capacitor and coil. In this case, it takes plug-in coils. But I've got a band switching arrangement in there that kind of spreads the band out on 75 meters, and with 160 it adds some padding. So that's why I have the toggle switch. It's a 2-band wave meter. By using capacitors and a switch, you can come up with a band spread situation where you get the entire band spread out on the dial. Okay, I'm looking down on a 1929 Hartley oscillator for the 160 meter band. And there's the wave meter, which is coupled into the main coil. And I've backed off a little bit so I don't have really tight coupling. The technique that we'll be using is called the current peak method. Looking at the current meter for the transmitter, watch that needle. When the needle wiggles, and of course when it peaks, as we tune the wave meter, that's going to indicate the frequency that the transmitter is on. We're transmitting. Okay, now, of course, I'm into a dummy load. See that? With the wave meter, I'm able to determine the frequency by looking at the current meter on the transmitter. So the frequency is around 1811. Now I'm going to use this calibrated wave meter. This calibrated wave meter, hopefully when brought close to the main coil, we should be able to determine the frequency by, again, watching the meter, the current meter. There we are. And according to this, it's somewhere between 10 and 20, 1811. So it's not perfect, but it's certainly getting us in the ballpark. If I had a better calibration on this thing, I'd be able to do better work. So the next subject we're going to tackle is calibration. How do we calibrate these things?
Prior to early 1927, radio amateurs were entitled to use the entire range of frequencies above 1500 kilohertz in a non-interfering basis. But the old man, TOM, was nervous in 1929 with the formalization of the new narrowband segments. Hiram Percy Maxim feared that amateurs could mess up the whole thing and we'd lose the amateur bands altogether if we did not control our frequencies. Here's the old man's plea to amateurs in 1929. I'm not going to read this, but it is attention-getting. Okay, so now we know with the advent of the new strict frequency allocations of 1927, agreed on by international treaty and the U.S. government reallocations, which would take place by the end of 1929, radio amateurs would have to make a great effort to stay inside the band. I introduced the two ways amateurs had in the 1920s. That of a calibrated oscillator, basically it's just a shielded regen receiver, and the calibrated wave meter. And with the latter, by keeping the coupling as loose as possible to what you're measuring, it could produce an accuracy of perhaps 0.25% or a few kilohertz. Professional and military wave meters had been around since the teens and were used throughout World War I, but these were basically long-wave instruments and made for rough transmitter testing only. Shortwave amateur operation during the Depression would involve constructing homemade gear. Few could afford the commercial instruments or the crystals. Let's consider the issue of calibration of this handmade gear. There were no calibrated signal generators, frequency counters, or harmonic marker generators. Crystals were extremely expensive and were only lately moving from the laboratory into the well-heeled ham shack. So how could the thousands of ordinary hams hope to comply with the new regulations? The first frequency calibration method I want to discuss is the direct measurement method using physics. Standing wave theory. The idea is to accurately measure a half wavelength using a technique known as Lecher wires. Lecher wires? I thought they were made for measuring UHF and microwave frequencies. Guess what? They work down to the lowest frequencies too, even 160 meters. This method can be used to calibrate the dial of a transmitter, a receiver, or a frequency meter, and it's done by physics alone. An accuracy of 0.2 to 1% of frequency is attainable according to this article appearing in Radio Magazine. The article claims that a 700 Hz to 3.5 kHz accuracy on the 80 meter band in a backyard setup is possible. This all works by the measurement of standing waves on a transmission line. Basically, we excite the lines with some type of oscillator, usually just a Hartley oscillator, and you put an AC meter across the far end of the open wire line. Then you move a shorting bar down the line until the meter peaks. This signifies a half-wave situation, open circuit point. Then you use this formula, D times 2, D being a half wavelength, times 12 inches, divided by 39.372, and you get the wavelength. So let's say we measured 42 meters. We then convert the wavelength to frequency. 300 divided by 42, or 7.142 megahertz. I'm not going to go through this entire article, but the method of using 140 feet of spaced open wire line gets you into the 80 meter band, or double that for 160 meters. It seems a bit tedious, guys. The primary method to this point would be to use generous harmonics of local broadcast stations. Local AM broadcast stations were fairly dirty at this time. So for instance, let's say we had a 700 kilohertz AM broadcast station. I'll call it WLW. Their fifth harmonic was exactly at 3.5 megahertz. How handy is that? The big border blaster, XERA in Mexico. A 1460 station times 5 is 7,300 kilohertz. That's the top of the 40 meter band. WJR at 750 kilohertz times 5 is 3750 kilohertz. So you get the idea. The third way was to use WWV or other commercial stations who transmitted standard shortwave frequencies, usually on a schedule. The final method was to listen on schedule with a frequency standard ham, basically a ham who had crystals like W1XP. W1XP and other stations across the country regularly put up signals on specified frequencies, kind of like beacon stations that we have today. There were even frequency measurement contests. You could win an award for accurately measuring frequency.
Okay, so that was a lot, and I understand that determining frequency is so easy now. You just spin the dial, and if somebody is off 10 hertz, you know about it. But back in the day, simply staying inside the band was very important.